Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for spending some of your Friday with me today. And thanks also to our awesome section, of which I am a council member, for making these virtual coffee talks happen. There's so much going on right now. Everybody's sort of beyond burnout. So I'm really, really excited to be here and just have the opportunity to talk a little bit about my new book, yay, which I think you can see in my background. It's called The Arab Spring Abroad, Diaspora Activism Against Authoritarian Regimes. I'm just gonna give a synopsis, a very brief and quick overview of some of the main takeaways, set the context up a little bit, and then I think we can just go to discussion and Q&A, because I think that's the funnest and most interactive part anyway. Okay, and Kristen, signal me if anything's going wrong or you can't hear me or something, because you're the person I can see best. All right. So I'm sure it's not that far back in your memories, if you can believe it now, 10 years on. But 10 years ago, we had something called the 2011 Arab Spring uprisings, which happened in places like Yemen, Egypt, Syria, and elsewhere. Of course, the conflicts are still very much ongoing, but at the time I had just started to do Middle East studies as a sociologist in graduate school. I was at Irvine, my first year, where Megan also is a proud alumna. And when I entered the program to do the study of social movements and conflict in the Middle East, people were like, okay, conflict I get, but are there social movements in the Middle East? And then all of a sudden the Arab Spring exploded. And what was really interesting is that in a roundabout way, all the field work I had planned to do in places like Yemen, I couldn't do anymore because of the revolutions themselves. So I stuck out in California, right? And I'm looking at what's going on back in these countries. But then I'm realizing through some of my advocacy that was going on outside of graduate school and my newfound connections on Twitter, that the Arab Spring was really exploding all over the world. And that what was going on, particularly in places like Yemen, Syria, and Libya, which were the countries that initially had the longest, most prolonged revolutions. The revolutions in these three countries were mobilizing the diaspora in new ways to support regime change and support, humanitarian relief back in their home countries. And what people were telling me online was that this has never happened before in the history of the diaspora. Of course, there'd always been, exiles and anti-regime movements sort of in abeyance or underground, but they never come out en masse from places like California and London and New York and Washington, D.C. to mobilize. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. And that's what became my dissertation project and now this book, which just came out last month with Cambridge. And we know as scholars of peace, war, and social change that transnational mobilization matters. Transnational movements play a huge role in social movements taking place across borders and social change processes. A lot of times they do that because they're the ones that are channeling international media attention and sort of the attention of policymakers to things that are going on overseas in the global South, especially, that might get ignored otherwise. And they're also channeling resources to their allies in other places that are sometimes cut off from media attention, cut off from having, cash supplies. So they're really important in that way. And given sort of the increasing speed at which globalization is happening, this is of course fueled by global capitalism, technological advances. There's been a lot of talk lately about social media. And then of course the rise of international institutions and INGOs since, World War II. So the point is, as transnational mobilization is not at all new, but because of globalization and these kinds of processes, it has gotten easier over time. So what we see is there's sort of this optimism in the literature, particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that activists all over the world, and particularly in the global North, have these international political opportunities for mobilization, to mobilize for relief in human rights and things of that nature in the global South. And now there's a separate body of literature outside of sociology that takes place more in area studies and in political science that's really looked at the role of diasporas and migration specifically in political change. So, we know that, of course, when authoritarian regimes are active, when war is happening, a lot of times in sort of the parlance of Albert Hirschman, exit, voice, and loyalty, those who want to express their voice are repressed and they're forced to exit. They're forced to leave their home countries. And so there's been this attention to literature about diasporas, as both peacemakers and peace wreckers in their home countries. Because through their transnational ties, through their enduring loyalties and their connections, through their remittances and their resources, they have a huge impact on crises that are happening in their home countries. And when they're mobilizing from democratic countries, they also tend to have a lot of opportunities for advocacy. They can lobby, they can protest, and so on and so forth. So what you have are these sort of concerns by scholars like Benedict Anderson on one hand, Samuel Huntington on the other, that these groups operate as unencumbered long-distance nationalists who are these powerful global actors. They can induce policy change, intervention, and so they wield voice and loyalty as a kind of weapon after exit against the regimes that forced them abroad in the first place. So you might think about like Ahmed Shalaby and his role in helping to justify the US invasion and occupation of Iraq. I think somebody is unmuted. If everybody could just be muted, that would be awesome. Thank you. So part of what my research set out to look at was, okay, we know transnational activism matters and we know diaspora mobilization matters, but we really haven't paid attention to explaining when diaspora movements emerge or the extent to which they actually are able to intervene in their home countries. And this is because a lot of the research that's been done has looked at positive cases of when diasporas have been really impactful and not looked at variation or even negative cases. So my research then set out to look at, okay, when do diaspora movements emerge? How and to what extent, do they intervene in their home countries, and under what conditions can they really make a difference? So as I mentioned, my book that just came out says that, diaspora activism is not this automatic product of exit, of people's loyalties to their home countries, or even the political opportunities they have in places like the United States or Great Britain for voice, for advocacy. But instead, their activism is much more contingent, and it's actually quite fragile. It's very much contingent on basically three things, and I'm going to unpack this a little bit. Home country conditions, whether or not they get geopolitical support from outside power holders, the media, and international organizations, and whether or not diasporas are able to continuously convert resources to a particular anti-regime or humanitarian cause over time. So let me just go into a few of the findings super quickly, and then we can open it up. So I found, for example, that one of the reasons that I actually found that Libyans, Syrians, and Yemenis mobilizing in the United States and Great Britain were very much quiet on matters of home country regime change and human rights abuses in their home countries before the Arab Spring was because there were two mechanisms at play that actually muted this voice after exit, that demobilized them from becoming transnational activists and outspoken regime critics. One was something I've been working on for a while now called transnational repression. This is efforts by home country regimes to actually silence voice in the diaspora. This was active primarily among Libyans and Syrians. What this meant is that regimes actively deploy agents to surveil the diaspora, to intimidate and threaten the diaspora, to hurt people's family members at home, and sometimes even to hunt activists abroad, like we've seen recently in the Saudi case. And so another mechanism that muted voice after exit, sorry, I have to go through this super fast, is what I also call conflict transmission. And this means that when anti-regime groups and identity groups are conflicting over how to instigate social change or regime change in their home countries, when they have to go abroad, these disagreements, these divisions also are transmitted to diaspora communities. This was present across cases. So I'm just going to provide a few examples of these two mechanisms, transnational repression and conflict transmission, that these groups had to overcome in order to mobilize for the Arab Spring. In one case, for example, we had a Syrian musician and artist, Malik Jandali, who performed in Washington, D.C. a few months after the first protest happened in Syria. He didn't even criticize the regime, but he just called for freedom and liberty in his homeland, in his beloved homeland, at a public concert. This raised the attention, this raised the hackles of the regime, the embassy in Washington, D.C. And what happened as a direct result was that his parents, his elderly parents, and I believe in Homs, Syria, were kidnapped by members of the secret police and beaten and told, this is what happens when your son speaks out. You know, this is a message for your son. And this kind of thing has been happening across the, revolution and before, and it's also been happening in some of the other cases, particularly among Libyans. So this is one of the big deterrents. People say, look what happens if you speak out against the regime, even if you do something as innocuous as say, liberty for Syria, liberty for Libya, this is what can happen. Another example of conflict transmission, which is again when these home country conflicts among the anti-regime diaspora travel abroad through ties that people carry with them. This was a particularly huge problem for Yemeni mobilization. Prior to 2011, I found that anytime people tried to talk about what to do about the dictator Saleh in Yemen, it was considered partisan and it got people fighting. It got people really angry with each other because in the diaspora, you had two groups. You had pro-unity Yemenis and you had Yemenis from south of Yemen who demanded independence for their territory. South Yemen used to be its own country. A lot of South Yemenis want South Yemen to be independent again. So anytime people were interested in talking about regime change, they got caught in this issue about whether or not the South should secede and their grievances should be treated separately versus pro-unity. And the two flags here represent those conflicting demands. So those are two examples of that. And this really divided the anti-regime diaspora in ways where people were just like, I can't deal with this. This is too toxic. I don't want to deal with home country politics. I'm just trying to live my life abroad. Okay, so then what happened during the Arab Spring? We have this state of demobilization. The diaspora is very much disempowered by these transnational deterrents, both transnational repression and conflict transmission. Well, once the Arab Spring began, these two deterrents were undermined for different reasons. Regarding transnational repression, the regimes were essentially fighting for their survival for a long time during the Arab Spring. This made them less able to enact transnational repression and successfully intimidate the diaspora. A lot of people said, my family members are involved in the revolution, so I don't care whether the regime knows who I am. And a lot of people said, look, people are being shot and killed in the street, tortured to death in prison for what's happening, for freedom. I can't just stay silent abroad. It doesn't make sense. So in that way, the Arab Spring motivated people to confront or overcome the costs of transnational repression. And then also we had newfound revolutionary coalitions come together in Syria, Libya, and Yemen to call for the fall of the regimes. So this temporary bringing together of anti-regime coalitions, movement actors who had been at odds before over, like I said, South Yemen versus unified Yemen, they came together temporarily. They put aside their differences to call for the fall of the regime. So this, in that way, helped to mobilize the diaspora as never before, as I mentioned in the beginning. Now, what did the diaspora actually do? I'm keeping an eye on time here. So different diaspora groups mobilized to different extents. I'm not going to go into all those details, but in general, I find that they contributed to the revolutions in 5 ways. And these are just some illustrative examples of how they did so. The first is they broadcasted the demands and the grievances and the claims of their allies in the home country to the world. And particularly doing so in English was very important because that tends to be, the global language in which we operate. They represented the revolutions abroad as lobbyists, as social movements to say, we are actually long distance members of the revolution and we're working abroad specifically to gain international support. They worked as brokers, so they literally sometimes would connect people that they knew from their hometowns in places like Homs, Syria, to the international media, to policymakers. I attended multiple speaking tours that Syrian Americans were holding such that they actually brought Syrians from Syria who were revolutionaries and speaking tours around the United States. So that was really interesting. And another thing, of course, they did is they remitted everything from diapers and cash to, satellite phones and bulletproof vests to the revolution. And then a lot of them also traveled home to volunteer on the ground, specifically in the Libya case. But the extent to which they were able to do so varies. Essentially, in a nutshell, Libyans were able to fulfill this 5-part tactical repertoire. Syrians, it varied between the US and Britain before dying off over time. And Libyans, they weren't able to do much more than broadcast demands and claims through lobbying and protest. So the degree to which the different groups were able to fulfill this repertoire varied a lot between the cases and over time. And the reasons that this varied was because of 2 factors. One was whether or not they were able to convert resources to the revolution, including their network ties, their diaspora community organizations, their social capital, and even, their personal savings accounts to this home country cause. The Yemenis, of course, were much more disadvantaged in doing so, being from a relatively poorer country, being more working class in the United States and Britain than Syrians and Libyans. And then also geopolitical support. With NATO intervention, essentially all of the countries that I was looking at very much supported the Libyan revolution. They actually didn't care if people went home to Libya to fight. Not so in the Syrian case, right? So anyway, geopolitical support varied a huge degree. This was the whether or not states, the media, and international agencies actually allied with diaspora causes. When they had geopolitical support, they were able to lobby successfully. They were able to move resources across borders. They were able to move themselves across borders to volunteer. Otherwise, they were essentially left on the sidelines and they couldn't do much else besides protest. And even after a while, protests seemed pointless because they didn't feel like anyone was listening. So in conclusion, I just want to make a few points. Diaspora movements can, of course, be very powerful global actors for social change in the home country. They can successfully threaten state power. They can perform life-saving work, and they can help to support insurgencies. So this supports calls by transnationalism scholars that we really need to look at these neglected dimensions of revolutions, that they're not bounded within the nation state, they're really transboundary phenomena. But also, I would say that the existing literature has been quite overly optimistic about the advantages that certain actors have in democratic states in the global north in terms of intervening or meddling in home country affairs. And this is because a lot of diasporas are simultaneously embedded in multiple social fields at once. They might live in the US and Britain. And of course, in addition to having political opportunities, they also face racism and discrimination. We can talk more about that. But in general, those who are wealthy, those who live in democratic societies should have advantages to intervene at home. But we also have to remember that they are simultaneously embedded in authoritarian contexts through their social ties therein. And this can embed them in these demobilizing and repressive social relations, like I discussed with transnational repression and conflict transmission. And for example, we're seeing transnational repression have a huge effect on Uyghurs and other dissidents from China, the Hong Kong diaspora right now, and many, many other groups. So right now, one of my next projects is I'm working on an edited volume to really bring new attention to transnational repression, because with the sort of what do they call the democracy recession that's happening in the world right now, we're seeing that the spaces where people can safely mobilize for human rights, for humanitarianism, is shrinking literally territorially in the world today. So we need to be very much attuned about how authoritarian regimes are working transnationally themselves to counteract human rights activism. And I'll leave it there, and I welcome any questions you might have about process, case selections, how I got this started in graduate school to, how it might relate to things going on in the world today. So thank you so much.